The Assembly Committee on Budget to order. Today will be our overview, or the beginning of our overview, of the governor's budget proposal. Do we need to take roll? No. We don't need to take roll. Okay, we don't need to have a quorum. Then I will begin today with my opening remarks, and our vice chair is not here. All right. Well, when he comes, I'll ask if he's got some comments he'd like to make, assuming he gets here before we start with our witnesses. We're going to begin with Mr. Giroux and Mr. Taylor, just those two testifying today. So I'll start with my opening statement, and then I'll ask both of those gentlemen to come forward. And committee members, if you could, hold your questions to the end. This will be our first hearing of 2010, probably the first of many. And before we begin the deliberations and the testimony, there's a couple points that I want to make just in opening. One about the governor's budget proposal, and one about the process that the committee will be embarking on and the legislature as a whole. In a word, the governor's proposal to me is disappointing. After we heard at length in the governor's State of the State address about how the governor's pig and the pony worked together, which was a very heartwarming little story, I expected a little more realistic and balanced approach to the budget and the crisis that California is facing. Our governor is the chief executive of the state of California, and yet this budget tries to pass the buck to the federal government. And we in the state need new ideas, leadership, and shared sacrifice to weather this ongoing budget crisis. The governor's budget proposal demands sacrifice only from those who are with the least in our society. His list of cuts will destroy the lives of women, children, and disabled throughout the state. This is a budget proposal that, if we adopted it, would have a body count. Compare that with this proposal merely asking rich corporations to wait 1 year to get their taxes enacted. Their tax cuts enacted, excuse me. There's a lot of sacrifice here, but it isn't shared. Instead of real solutions, the budget we received is a one-sided political document that simply doesn't fix our budget problems. So, in essence, what has happened is the legislature will start today without a real budget framework to build upon. By producing a budget that is unrealistic on its face, the governor has abdicated his responsibility and shifted the burden to the legislature to craft a budget proposal which he will then respond to. And I have to say, members, as chair of this committee, and I won't speak for you, but I have a feeling you probably agree to at least some extent, that's a responsibility that the legislature will take very, very seriously. So it's our challenge as a legislature to find a way to solve the budget problem in a polarized political climate, and to do that together. And I asked the Department of Finance, the LAO, and the Governor's Office to work with the legislature to craft a budget that addresses California's ongoing budget and fiscal crisis while still reflecting the goals and the priorities of a majority of Californians. That's our mutual challenge. That's our shared responsibility, and that's the challenge that I think this committee is beginning to meet today. And that brings me to how we accomplish that objective. In my opinion, we need to improve the budget process to make it better for both legislators and for the public, to make it more transparent. Legislators, when we go to vote on this budget, need to know the details of what we are voting for, and in the process, the public needs to have a say in it. This time, you may remember last year, we were lurching from crisis to crisis. We were needing to act so fast that there was very, very little time to deliberate, talk to our constituents, or examine and think about potential solutions. At this time last year, we were literally trying to do the people's business while the alarm bells were ringing, and that is a problem. It does not lead to good decision making. So I am going to try, as the chair of this committee, to build a better budget in the sunshine of a public process rather than in the back room of the Big Five. This budget belongs to the people of the state of California, and whether it's a good budget or a bad budget, it is their budget. And we owe it to them as their representatives to ensure that their participation in crafting their budget is a meaningful one. We owe it to them to debate competing budget proposals out in the open, and after years of cuts and reduced budget services, we can't take public support for granted. We need to know how much the public is prepared to tolerate when we look at ways to close this budget gap. Last year, we retooled the operations of the conference committee process to achieve many of these goals, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that again. I know it was a very painful process for those of us that had to sit through it, but it was really inspirational to hear how people had driven literally for 9 hours in some cases to give us their input. It was that important to them. And as the choices get tougher, so do the consequences. And I'm hoping that in this year's process, we'll be able to give ordinary people a reasonable opportunity to be heard. So I look forward to working with the vice chair, who just arrived, and the subcommittee chairs and all the members of this committee in order to begin this very difficult task in this very difficult year in finding viable solutions that fix our problem and receive the 2/3 bipartisan support we need for adoption. So those are my opening statements today, and Mr. Nielsen, I'd like to ask if you'd like to have some statements before we go to our witnesses.
But briefly, and I thank you, Madam Chair. It was a pleasure working with you and our Budget Committee colleagues last year. We have daunting challenges yet this year, but I like to look at it as maybe with a more optimistic eye. The figures are arguable, but it looked to me like we came here a year ago in December with about a $42 billion problem, and now it would be arguable somewhere around 20 or so. I'd like to say it's half better than it was. It really probably isn't, but maybe that gives some cause for optimism. And I am confident that we can work together. As I said in many occasions in budget conference committees, though, I would suggest to the audience, all who come here to plead your causes and cases, make your arguments, just coming here and asking for things not to be cut or to be funded more is not something that will work in these times. Come and suggest to us alternatives, things that can be done better, more efficiently, more effectively, with less cost to government, if that's possible. That would be constructive and that would be helpful. It is incumbent on all of us to come up with constructive ideas. Have forbearance as we work together, and again, as the Chair suggests, come up with a good bipartisan budget that takes another step, getting us down the way to strong fiscal solvency and a buoyant economy. And frankly, I don't care what we do as a budget committee or the legislature or the administration. Till the economy becomes robust again, we're never going to get out of this problem. So as a part of our budget discussions, deliberation, negotiations, sensitivity to those economic imperatives is critical, particularly economic disincentives, of which there are many. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nielsen. And now I'll ask our two witnesses to come forward. Mr. Giroux, am I saying it right, Giroux? Yeah. From the Department of Finance, and Mac Taylor, the legislative analyst. And we'll start with Mr. Giroux and then go on to Mr. Taylor. And then in the meantime, members, if you could hold your questions till the end, and then we'll have a lengthy discussion. Mr. Giroux, and welcome. This is your first time testifying in this particular capacity.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Madam Chair and members, I am Todd Giroux, Chief Deputy Director for Budget at the Department of Finance. And before I go directly into the budget numbers, I wanted to make some brief comments regarding the economy in general. The budget does project that California is slowly emerging from the recession. While recovery has begun, economic growth is very modest and high unemployment still persists. The outlook for California economy is modest growth in 2010, followed by moderate growth in 2011 and good growth in 2012. Personal income is estimated to fall by 2.8% in 2009, but then is projected to grow by 2.4% in 2010, 3.6% in 2011, and 4.8% in 2012. Non-farm payroll employment is projected to fall by 5.6% in 2009, and is forecast to fall by 0.7% in 2010, but then grow by 1.3% in 2011 and 1.9% in 2012. Translating this into budget revenues, we are not expecting to return to where we thought we were going to be in prior revenue forecasts. Rather, baseline revenues fell by more than 20% from their peak, and they're expected to remain for several years approximately 30% lower than they were in our 2007-8 projections. So with that economic context in mind, when the budget was enacted late July, we were projecting a shortfall of $6.9 billion for the 10-11 fiscal year. And In the governor's budget, we're now projecting that shortfall to be $19.9 billion for a variety of factors. Specifically, the factors are revenue estimates are $3.4 billion lower, primarily driven by lower projections for both the personal income tax and the sales and use tax, offset by some increases in corporation tax and various other factors. The second major category that led to this larger shortfall is that federal and state court decisions have reduced or eliminated budget solutions that were adopted in previous years, and this is cost of $4.9 billion. And these include $2.4 billion related to the Shaw case, approximately $1.1 billion related to the CDCR medical receivers proposed budget, $1 billion related to the sale of SCIF's assets being tied up in litigation, and then nearly $400 million related to IHSS wage reduction and cost containment proposals. Next, we had erosions of previous solutions that result in $2.3 billion, and these are primarily related to two items. One is $1 billion related to the timing and the ultimate size of the corrections package from last year, and then $1.1 billion related to Medi-Cal flexibility from the federal government. This was assumed to be ongoing, but we only received the money on a one-time basis. And lastly, to get to the $19.9 billion, we had various workload budget adjustments totaling $1.4 billion, and then we did include a modest reserve of $1 billion. So to close the budget gap, the governor's budget proposes a combination of spending reductions, alternative funding, and additional federal funds. The largest category of these is expenditure reductions totaling $8.5 billion, the largest of which is $2.9 billion in various health and human services programs, and I will hit on some of those major ones. We have $1 billion in Medi-Cal. This is primarily associated with utilization controls and expanding cost-sharing requirements. These are some things that other states have done, so we're looking at some of those options. Other items in that $1 billion includes reducing benefits for newly qualified immigrants and eliminating adult day health care. Next, we have $1 billion in IHSS due to limiting state participation in wages and also reducing services. $300 million in SSI SSP. This is by reducing grants for individuals to the federal MOE and eliminating the cash assistance program for immigrants. And then we have $200 million in developmental services, most notably is through extending the 3% provider payment reduction that is existing in this current year through 10/11. Then we have $200 million in CalWORKs, the majority of which is a 15.7% grant reduction, which will reduce California's grant levels to the average of the 10 highest cost of living states. Next, we have $2.4 billion total savings in Prop 98 over 3 years. These savings are primarily generated by designating a portion of the 2008-9 overappropriation to offset maintenance factor owed as of 2007-8. And this would reduce the Prop 98 guarantee in both 2009-10 and 10/11 by approximately $800 million. In addition, we proposed delaying the start of the in lieu maintenance factor payments that were adopted as part of the 2009 budget. And finally, as a result of our transportation proposal, which was necessitated by the court decisions on allowable uses of the public transportation account, the Sal General Fund revenues decrease, and this has a direct impact on the Prop 98 guarantee. However, even with these changes, the governor's budget meets the minimum guarantee for Prop 98 and maintains year-over-year funding for Prop 98. In total, Prop 98 expenditures are projected to be $49.9 billion in 9/10 and $50 billion in 10/11. The next major expenditure reduction is $1.6 billion in employee compensation, and primarily the largest factor is $1.4 billion associated with what we call the 555 proposal, and this includes a 5% across-the-board salary reduction, a 5% increase in employees' contributions for their retirement, and a corresponding 5% reduction in their state contribution. And then the last piece is a cap on the cost of states' workforce at a level 5% lower than present. We also have $1.2 billion in the area of corrections and rehabilitation. $811 million of this is by funding the inmate medical program at a level similar to New York. And then $317 million by having certain non-serious, nonviolent felons serving their time in county jail instead of state prison. The next major category of solutions is alternative funding, which accounts for $3.9 billion of our solution. The first major component saves $986 million due to a proposal to eliminate the sales tax on fuel and increase the excise tax on fuel by 10.8 cents, which maintains funding for transportation and reduces net taxes on consumers by $976 million. The general fund benefit from this fuel tax is associated with is as follows: $675 million from using the increased excise tax to fund debt service on Prop 1B and seismic retrofit bonds. $311 million by funding transit projects at Intercity Rail with 2009-10 public transportation account revenues. And then, as I mentioned before, there's an $836 million reduction to the Prop 98 guarantee, which was included in the $2.4 billion I described earlier. The remaining alternative funding proposals include $1 billion by using Prop 10 funds for children's services and using Prop 63 for state mental health services, which both require a vote of the people. $500 million by having counties redirect their savings related to other HHS cuts to fund an increased share in children's programs. $297 million is from automated speed enforcement, and this would utilize the existing red light monitoring systems to catch drivers who are speeding through intersections, and these funds would be used to offset the general fund that goes to the trial court budget. And then we have $240 million from using the remaining authorized hospital fees from recently enacted legislation to support children's health coverage in Medi-Cal. $200 million from funding a portion of the CAL FIRE budget with proceeds from the Governor's Emergency Response Initiative. $118 million from permanently funding state parks with proceeds from the Tea Ridge oil lease, and this also assumes revenues in 910, which would increase the total benefit over the 2 years to $197 million. And then finally, we have $59 million by supporting the DOJ Crime Lab program with an additional $2 increase in penalty assessments. The next major solution category is federal funds. The budget assumes that the state will receive $6.9 billion in federal funds that is owed to California. These items include $1.8 billion by increasing the federal medical assistance percentage, or commonly known as FMAP, that rate for California from 50% to 57%, which would put California at the national average and at the average of the 10 most populous states. $1 billion by securing reimbursement for costs that should have been paid by Medicare and changes in the required level of state payment for prescription drug benefits. $2.1 billion for the continuation of a portion of the Federal Recovery Act funding for various health and human services programs. $94 million from updating the federal funding formula for foster care. $1 billion from special education mandates at a level commensurate with requirements under federal law. And then lastly, $880 million for full reimbursement from SCAP, which is the State Criminal Alien Assistance Program, where the states get reimbursed for incarcerating undocumented immigrants. Now, in the event that the federal government fails to provide the $6.9 billion of additional funding, the budget identifies other spending reductions and an extension of revenue increases that will go into effect using a trigger contained in the budget. While we are confident that the federal funds will materialize, the budget provides this trigger as a safety valve mechanism to ensure the budget is balanced and to ensure that we have sufficient cash to obtain necessary financing regardless of the outcome of the federal funds. These trigger solutions are comprised of $4.6 billion of expenditure reductions and $2.4 billion of revenues. And the trigger reductions include the following: $1 billion from the elimination of CalWORKs, $847 million by funding additional mental health services with Prop 63 funds. This is in addition to the solution I already noted. $532 million by reducing Medi-Cal eligibility to the minimum allowed under federal law. $508 million from an additional 5% across-the-board pay cut for state employees. $495 million from the elimination of IHSS. $325 million from redirecting additional county savings. $280 million additional corrections and rehabilitation reductions, primarily eliminating the non-court required inmate rehabilitation programs and expanding the crimes where the felons would serve locally. $126 million from the elimination of the Healthy Families Program, $112 million by eliminating funding for enrollment growth for higher ed, $115 million by eliminating various health services programs funded by Prop 99, $100 million from an unallocated reduction to the trial courts, $79 million by freezing the level of awards and income eligibility for Pell Grants, and then the last reduction is $36 million by eliminating funding for the Transitional Housing Placement for Foster Youth Plus program. The trigger revenues include the following, and I know these are all a one-year delay. $1.2 billion from extending the net operating loss suspension, $504 million from extending the dependent credit reduction, $315 million from delaying the use of business credits by unitary groups of corporations and instead retaining current law, which requires subsidiaries to have their own tax liability to use research and development and other credits. $300 million from delaying the change to the single sales factor allocation method for multi-state corporate income and instead retaining the double-weighted sales property and payroll formula. And the last is $20 million by lowering to 30% the first-year phase-in of the ability of corporations to carry back losses 2 years to offset prior tax profits. And so before I conclude, I wanted to briefly comment on both the special session and cash. Last Friday, January 8th, the governor did declare a fiscal emergency and called the Prop 58 special session. The budget proposes solutions for action in the special session that will close approximately $8.9 billion of the shortfall. And these actions are assumed to be done by March 1st. Any delays in the adoption of the proposals until enactment of the 10-11 budget will result in a loss of up to $2.4 billion in solutions, which will necessitate even deeper cuts in 2010-11. And finally, on cash, the governor's budget projects that the state will have sufficient cash to repay the entire $8.8 billion of RANs that are due in May and June 2010 as scheduled. Although we will face cash challenges in March 2010 and again next year beginning in July of 2010. The budget solutions will substantially reduce the gap for cash, but external financing will be necessary early in the upcoming fiscal year. In addition, it is likely that payment deferrals will still be necessary to manage the daily inflow and outflow and to reduce the need for external borrowing. At this point, we're still working with the State Controller's Office and the State Treasurer's Office on the final cash projections and to develop the actual additional cash solutions that we will submit to the legislature in the special session. And so that concludes. I want to thank you for allowing me to present the governor's budget proposal. And after the legislative analyst is done making his presentation, my colleagues and I will do our best to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Taylor, take it away.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Yesterday, we put out a document, an overview of the governor's budget. I hope that you all have a copy in front of you. If you don't, I know that Sergeant can provide you with one. There's really two purposes for us. We try to get the document out as soon as we can. And the first is simply to help you understand what's in the governor's proposal. As you can tell from Mr. Giroux's presentation, they're throwing a lot of stuff at you. And I would like to just point out a couple of charts that I think you and your staff would find helpful. First of all, on page 6, there's a full-page figure that lists all of the major solutions that the administration is proposing. And I think it can kind of give you a sense for the categories that Mr. Giroux mentioned, the reductions, the federal funds, alternative financing, and other solutions, and the relative magnitudes of those solutions, how they contribute to the governor's way of addressing the problem. I'd also like to just point out on page 15, there's a table there, and this is a list of the so-called trigger reductions. That is, to the extent that you don't get the federal funds that the administration is requiring or is asking for, is expecting, these are the reductions that Mr. Giroux mentioned, the $6.9 billion that would also kick in. But in addition to just explaining the governor's proposal, and I would point out we have more lengthy write-ups on the transportation and K-12, the Prop 98 proposals. If those are of particular interest to you in the document. But we also give you just some of our initial comments on the governor's proposal. And I think probably the most important one, given the magnitude of the governor's federal funds assumptions, is related to that. And we certainly think it's appropriate for the administration to be pursuing added federal funds. There's a lot of program areas. There are a lot where you can make a strong case that the federal government should be paying more, whether it's in special education, where they made a commitment to pay for 40%, or the so-called SCAP program, incarcerating undocumented immigrants, where they don't pay, they pay just a minor piece of the cost that we incur, to even educating kids in schools, undocumented immigrants, where we pay over $2 billion. There are a lot of areas where you can make a strong case for the feds ponying up more money to pay for what are, in fact, their responsibilities. The question is, what can you reasonably expect to get in 2010-11? And certainly what we've seen and heard from our congressional leaders, from past actions on many of these requests, which have been around for a long time, we just don't think there's any way you're going to get close to that $7 billion. We'd think you'd be lucky to get, say, $3 billion of that, and probably more on a short-term basis, the extension of the FMAP, say, for example. Now, that can be very, very helpful to you. But the real question is, what do you plan on? What do you, as at least in starting your budget deliberation, how much do you want to count on? Now, to the governor's credit, they did say, well, if you don't get those funds, here's what we would cut. But I think you need to go into it not expecting to get that amount, and therefore you're going to need to turn, if not to those reductions that he's proposed, to other alternatives that you find more palatable. So that's obviously a crucial assumption in this budget, the amount of federal funds. Now, in a budget, and as tough a year as you're going to have, and this is going to be an incredibly daunting year for you. I think it's going to be as difficult as the one you went through last year. There are going to be problems with any set of proposals from the administration or the alternatives that you will come up with. But let me just give a few examples of ones that we've spotted in the administration's proposal. For example, some I think you just can't count on the savings that they've suggested you can get. And I think a good example of that is the assumption on the receiver health care cost. It is certainly a good goal for you to try to reduce your prison health care costs down from what they are now, which are incredibly high. But you're not going to cut them in half by July 1. It's just not going to happen. So I think the goal may be appropriate, but you have to be more realistic about what you're going to budget for savings. As far as there's legal risk, and these are always going to occur, but I think one example of that is on the proposal, the 555 that Mr. Drew mentioned, and the 5% where the state saves by having employees pay an additional contributions towards their retirement. There's no question you can do that for new employees and change the contribution level. There certainly, at best, is a very real legal question on whether you can pose that on existing employees. So again, I'd separate the policy goal, where maybe greater sharing is appropriate in some cases, or changing our structure in our retirement benefits, but we're not sure you can get that right away. And then if there are at least some proposals where we're not sure they're fiscally wise, and let me give you an example on IHSS. You reduced IHSS costs by cutting off the people who had the least need of those who are in the program. And I'm certainly not going to say that you can't reduce cost in your IHSS program in other ways. But the governor's proposal, in our view, would take it to the point where you are eliminating services to the people who will go into skilled nursing facilities, and it will cost you money to implement that proposal. So in thinking about IHSS, if you do feel like you have to make reductions to it, you want to do it in such a way that you're not hurting yourself, that you are saving money by making sure that the people who otherwise would be institutionalized, who are getting IHSS services, continue to get those. So you want to be smart in the way that you approach those proposals. And as we have done in past years, we will be offering you, as Mr. Nielsen mentioned, alternatives to some of the governor's proposals that will still get you savings, but hopefully will mitigate perhaps some of the more harmful effects on recipients. The Proposition 98, for those of you who didn't have to get involved in this issue last year, count yourself lucky. It's an incredibly complicated matter that frankly involves constitutional issues that you tried to address through statute. And based on what the administration is now proposing, I'm afraid you're probably going to have to revisit the issues that you talked about last year. because there are real questions about just what do we owe, what might a court require us to pay as far as this so-called maintenance factor that was either created or not created in the 2008-9 year. So that's going to be a difficult issue for you because it's a big part of the administration's solution. And as always, when you're fashioning a budget, the 98 tends to be one of those key pieces you need to know how you're going to approach. Now, I would note that if you look at this on that page 6, the savings that the administration has, there's not that much that they're counting on savings in the current year. And the biggest piece is related to 98, which you don't really have to do in the special session. So I'd close by just making a couple comments on timing. I don't think it's not so much an issue of whether you need to do things in the special session as much as do you need to take action early in order to get full year savings on many of the proposals that the administration certainly has proposed and on ones that you feel that you need to act on also. They tend to be in the area of health, social services, and perhaps in corrections. So we don't really fundamentally disagree with the administration that early action, say by late March, will ensure that whatever savings you enact, you'll get full year amounts for 10-11. But there is an issue whether it has to be done in a special session versus just done early. Clearly, the governor has made some very difficult choices, but I think he at least deserves credit for putting his priorities on the line. And the fact that he did put his trigger list, he didn't just leave it for the federal funds assumption, he puts his priorities out there. Clearly, many of you will have different priorities, and that's only appropriate. The legislature passes the budget, and it should reflect your priorities. But you are going to have to make some very difficult choices. You're going to have to prioritize many of your programs. And as we said earlier in November, you're not going to solve your long-term budget this year. Even if you did everything that the governor has proposed, even under the administration's own numbers, you're still left with a $5 to $6 billion problem in the out years. But what that says to us is take as many ongoing actions as you can, try to limit the one-time, and make good progress. When you balance your budget for 10-11, make good progress towards meeting your longer-term problem. So with that, obviously my staff and I stand ready to help you get through this very difficult year, and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I think a very good kind of reality check here. And I will have some questions for you in a moment. I'd like to start with Mr. Giroux. I have a couple, well, at least one clarification, possibly a couple more, and then a little more detail on some things. But you alluded to various programs being eliminated that are currently being funded by Proposition 99. And of course, I know you're aware that one of my concerns, and I think it's a bipartisan one, is with respect to the funding of Every Woman Counts, which is a very, very valuable program which provides breast cancer screening to low-income women. And that has already been, the governor has already eliminated services for women over the age of 40 and stopped enrollment because of lack of Prop 99 funds. And this committee will be holding a hearing on that in much, much greater detail later. So I'm not asking you to address all of that right now, but this is just by way of introduction about my concern about these programs. When you say various programs that are funded by Prop 99, what programs do you mean?
Just a second, please. Turn to my notes. Oh. Let Mr. Kapoor answer that question.
Jay Kapoor with the Department of Finance. You're correct. Every Woman Counts is one of the programs that is funded with the Prop 99 tobacco tax revenues, and it is one of the programs that is part of that trigger.
So that is one of the programs that would be eliminated under this proposal. Are there others?
Yes, Tom Williams from the Department of Finance. Some of the other programs would be the Expanded Access to Primary Care, the EAPC program, the asthma program, the Major Risk Medical Insurance program under the, and the Access for Infants and Mothers program, the AIM program, would also, the Prop 99 funding for those programs would also be eliminated.
Now, Prop 99 is separate from the general fund, correct?
Correct.
So there's still money being generated under Prop 99. Why would we be eliminating these programs in order to balance the general fund deficit?
The Prop 99 funds would be shifted to the Medi-Cal program that we're eliminating from the other programs. So that would then generate the general fund savings in the Medi-Cal program.
Mr. Taylor, did you have a comment on that?
No,
Is
just
that
that was
legal?
my understanding, that they're backfilling what otherwise would have been general fund cost.
Okay, but Prop 99, that's an appropriate use of Prop 99 funds? That's what I'm...
Apparently. I've talked with my staff. Apparently there are some ways which we can do that.
I would like to know that, under what conditions that can be done, and whether it takes any act of the legislature in order to do that. That was my first question. Going on to education, we all listened very intently and applauded, actually, when the governor, in a State of the State address, said very, very clearly he was going to protect K through 12 education funding. And yet, well, I guess my question is, how does this budget proposal do that? Because I read it as being quite a substantial cut to funding under Prop 98.
Gina Pesa, Department of Finance. We protect it by maintaining the same level of funding in a budget with the types of reductions that we had made. Maintaining a program budget intact year over year over year is protecting the budget for education. And we do provide additional funding for community colleges as well as UC and CSU.
So in terms of, no, I'm not discussing CSU and UC. I think they've been pretty much made whole in this budget, and I think that's to the administration's credit, by the way, and I was very pleased to see that. But it's the K through 12 funding that I'm particularly concerned about, because I think what I and many, many others heard in the governor's State of the State address was a laudable goal to not provide cuts to K through 12 education, and yet I believe the way that the Prop 98 calculations are made, and I won't pretend to be an expert on that, but it looks to me like there's over $2 billion less in funding going to K through 12 over last year and the year before. And there's some calculations that were made going back a couple of years ago in order to do that. And to me, that does not mean what the governor said in his State of the State address.
Part of the reductions relate to some of the transactions that happened in the transportation area, which are unrelated to our decision. So that just reduced the SAL general fund, which impacts the guarantee, as Mr. Giroux said. The other adjustments that we made would not result in current year cuts to Proposition 98. So we protect schools from mid-year cuts, which is what we hear is the most difficult for them to do. They can plan for having to make adjustments for the upcoming school year, but when we make the mid-year cuts is when they have difficulty making the reductions. It is true that if without the proposals that we have in place, we would be required to fund education at a higher level. Having said that, the cuts that we're having to make in other areas are difficult enough without having to cut them even further and not make these additional that we think are equitable, because we do maintain the funding for education at a minimum flat for all 3 years.
So then what the governor said in his State of the State address was simply that he would maintain Prop 98 minimum funding, not that he would not cut
My
schools?
recollection of what the governor stated was that he would protect education. I don't believe he made reference to Prop 98 or K-12 or higher ed. He said education as a
Education
total.
funding is what he said.
Correct.
So he,
In
okay,
total.
well, we can parse that statement, I guess.
Madam
But let-
Chair, are we saying that protect should be in quotation marks? Protect?
I guess it depends on the meaning of protect. Let's break this down, though, a little bit more. Because the way I understand the way in which the governor's budget proposal is written, there's two different factors that reduce the funding in terms of real dollars of K through 12. One being the gas excise sales tax swap, which reduces the level of general fund upon which the Prop 98 calculation is based, which therefore reduces in turn the amount of money that will go to K through 12. That's one component?
Correct.
Yeah. Then the second component, as I understand it, is we go back in time. We turn the clock back a couple of years, and the governor is contending that there was, and I forgive me if I use the wrong terminology, but basically that there was some overfunding during that fiscal year, and that if you go back and recalculate Prop 98 based on what he says should have been the basis, then we would reduce it even further this year.
Right, correct. So if we went back in time, when the Budget Act was enacted back in July, we made assumptions for the calculation of the guarantee for what we knew at the time when the budget was signed. What happened since then is revenues actually dropped $3 billion more than what we anticipated when we made the calculation. So we funded the guarantee at $49 billion, which we all believed were the relevant factors at the time. When we revised our numbers based on what we know now, had we done the calculation with the revised numbers, the guarantee for 8-9 would have been $46 billion. So we're not taking any of the $49 billion away from schools, and we calculate off of that base. What we're doing is saying we had a maintenance factor payment that was owed for prior years as of 7-8. Because of that over-appropriation that we funded between the $46 and the $49 billion, we are requesting that the legislature basically designate that we've paid that debt off, because in essence we've over-appropriated the guarantee in that year by over $2.2 billion. So when you do that and you calculate the next year's base, you don't have to build as much back in because you don't owe the maintenance factor for that year anymore. So that reduces the guarantee in 9-10 by about $800 million, and the like savings in the following year.
Okay, let me just briefly explore the meaning of the word, or your use of the word over appropriation, because it's my understanding that Prop 98 sets a minimum, not a maximum funding level. And I think sometimes we make the mistake, and I've seen this in other arenas as well, with other kinds of laws, where a minimum is established, we kind of treat that as the ceiling. So the way I'm understanding your use of the word over appropriation is it would require the legislature to agree that we should go back, assuming we use those numbers and we recalculated the way the governor is suggesting, it would require the legislature to go back and agree that we would not have given, we would not have funded K through 12 at that higher level.
No. You would not change that appropriation level. You would continue to fund that. What we're asking the legislature to do is, in a sense, erase the $1.4 billion in maintenance factor that was owed and assume that we pay it within the $49 billion that you appropriated. We're not asking you to come down to the $46 billion, and we calculate the guarantee off of that higher base for the following year. But what maintenance factor does when it's owed is it compares revenue year over year, and when your revenue's higher, you pay back some of that debt. We would have had to pay an additional $800 million or so more if we still recognize that debt. We're asking that you not recognize it as still outstanding, that it in essence was paid off.
Mr. Taylor, is this part of the issue that you were referring to earlier? That's what I thought, because we
Yes.
did grapple with this last year.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm still troubled by the fact that there was a bald-faced statement made in the State of the State address that got a certain response, and I think was calculated to get a very positive response. And then it looks like, you know, something different is happening in the budget, and it's disappointing. But I'll move on to a couple of other issues. The cuts. We have $8.5 billion in cuts, just right on the table. But then what I want to know is, does that $8.5 billion in cuts include the triggered cuts, or are those in addition to that $8.5 billion?
No, the trigger cuts are not part of that number, because the trigger cuts and the trigger revenues are not actually our proposal to solve the $20 billion shortfall.
Okay.
Those are a trigger to the federal fund item.
Got it. So if those federal funds do not materialize, and it's my understanding that we would have to get every single dollar that the governor's suggesting we get in order to avoid that trigger.
That's the way it's written currently, yes.
Okay. So if that didn't happen, as Mr. Taylor is suggesting is very likely not to happen, we've got an additional $4.6 billion on top of the $8.5 billion in cuts. So it's about a $13 billion worth of cuts out of an $18.9 billion deficit, most of which is related to Health and Human Services. Correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, I find that very, very troubling, particularly on top of the cuts that we made last year. And then the final question I have for you, Mr. Giroux, is the on the proposal to go back to the voters on Props 63 and 10. Is there any objective reason to believe that the governors will give us a different result this time than they did in May?
I'm not really sure if I know how the voters will react to that. Obviously, in the May election, there wasn't a lot of support for a large variety of measures, but I think one of the problems was that there were so many items put in front of the voters.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is, has any research been done with respect to whether or not the voters would have a different response this year, or are you just
I'm
throwing
not aware
it
of
out?
any. I'll have to check and get back to you if there's any research available.
Okay, because one of the things that Mr. Taylor kind of brought up in his comments is, well, actually said outright, there's a lot of things in this budget proposal that aren't likely to happen. And that's one of those things that, in my opinion, isn't likely to happen. And when I look at this proposal as a whole, trying to close an $18.9 billion deficit, I worry about how much of this is likely to happen, particularly given how much didn't happen last year that we're now having to pay for this year and next year. So that, if you could get back to me on that, I would greatly appreciate it. Mr. Taylor, that actually brings me to my first question of you, which is, when you look at this budget proposal, have you added up how much of this is not likely to happen? You said a lot of the federal funds aren't likely to materialize. Much of the savings assumed are not likely to materialize. And I'm kind of wondering, of the $19.9 billion, how much isn't likely to materialize?
Well, again, what makes that difficult? Even if we don't think you're going to get all the federal funds, we'd have to make some assumptions then about his alternative cuts. So they could rightly argue, well, okay, assume we're not going to get the federal funds and just turn to our triggered cuts, and you'd have to then assess those. So no, we haven't put a specific number, but certainly there are several billion dollars that are problematic, shall we say. And again, in a budget like this, you're going to have some amount, and whether that's just, you try to minimize the problems that you have with your solutions. So I can't give you a specific number, but there's certainly several major ones that you're not likely to get the full amount of savings the governor is asking for, even if you did the actions.
Well, here's the challenge as a legislator, and I think the entire committee and actually both houses of the legislature are going to have to face. When we're presented with a budget where the assumptions don't hold water, we've got to start from square one. And if we're going to look at a proposal which realistically is $13 billion worth of cuts to close an $18.9 billion deficit, that's basically an all-cuts budget. And a large, vast majority of this legislature is not going to want to start there. So we've got to find some other starting point. And that's the struggle that I'm having here is I feel like we've got to go, we, the legislature, have to go back to the beginning and come up with something new, from whole cloth. I'm not feeling a whole lot of assistance from the administration in doing that. And so that's why I'm asking how much of this is solid, how much is not, and perhaps that's an answer you can provide in a later time. But for us to be able to do our work, we kind of have to have that baseline from which to work, and I don't feel like we've got it right now.
Well, there are proposals on here that I think you should consider, and it may be that you just want to consider alternatives to them. And I mentioned the one like on IHSS, where there are savings that you can achieve. Now, you may find them unacceptable, even on those, and then that's your choice. But I certainly wouldn't discount all of these. You're going to have to look at these areas. Part of your problem is because of the federal funds, the ERA money, you can't do a whole lot in schools. You had to do kind of what the administration's proposing, that kind of rebenches in a way through this transportation proposal, and by going back and relooking at 8-9 was the way that they got additional savings out of schools. But otherwise, because of the MOE, the maintenance of effort that the feds imposed, we weren't going to be able to get too much out of them. And again, you can't get too much out of Medi-Cal because of the ERA restrictions on those funds. So you're left with a relatively small part of your budget of achieving the rest of the reductions. So you're going to have to look in these areas, and you're going to have to take actions similar to some of these. It's just that we think you ought to put a lot more on the table. Now, you mentioned you were happy with the higher ed budget. They did do very well in this budget. They got enrollment growth, for example. Well, I'm not sure you're going to be able to afford that. You may have to look at higher ed You may have to look at other areas of the budget where the governor didn't cut. The courts. And because you just don't have a lot of choices. So I certainly wouldn't say, Madam Chair, that you should just start from scratch. He's given you a lot of proposals, and even if you don't like them, we're going to be offering you some alternatives that will get you some savings that I think would mitigate the impacts on citizens. But you're going to have to look at areas where he did not touch in the budget. So,
Well, I notice in your comments, you're talking about more cuts and more savings and not more revenues.
well, we did mention, as a part of our solution, that we should look at revenues.
Yeah, okay. I just
So-
want to make sure everything's on the table, because that's, in my opinion,
Absolutely.
the better way to do it. Okay.
And the governor has, in his triggers, he has put some things on revenues, $2.4 billion worth. So the fact that it's on his trigger list doesn't mean you can't consider it for your main list, and that you can't look at other things. Now, we have stressed things that didn't go to those increases in your kind of broad-based taxes, which you've already increased and are very high. But that doesn't mean there still aren't other options available to you, including looking at tax expenditures or he has a fee proposal, again, his so-called emergency response initiative, and his T-Ridge, for example, which is a controversial proposal, but also is a revenue proposal. So you clearly should be looking at revenue proposals as part of balancing this budget.
I, as well as Ms. Harkey, just sat through a couple of hours this morning in Rev and Tax and heard a lot of interesting and provocative testimony on that subject. Mr. Giroux, I did have one last question. I apologize, forgot to ask you this. When we were talking about the Prop 63 and Prop 10 issue, my question is, what does the governor have in mind if those propositions were to fail a second time? Where would we go to replace that revenue assumption?
I think at this point we don't have any exact proposals to put in front of you, but we would come back and work with you on additional solutions.
Yeah, I think it's only fair if we were to do that, we'd need to know what the other alternatives are. Questions from other members? Keep your hands up. I'm going to have Mr. Griffith here take a list. We'll start with Mr. Nielsen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick point as to revenues, that I think we have to be a little bit cautious about embracing great increases in revenues, putting a lot of stock in that in terms of handling our budget problem. I would argue that that simply funds what's broken and invites future funding above that. Even I've suggested maybe rolling back the whole base to somewhere 2 to 4 years ago and start from there again, almost zero-based budgeting beginning with a earlier base year. Question for Mr. Giroux. The unrealized savings are, I think, a big deal. I think we might not have historically paid enough attention to it. One of which, historically, not just currently, has been adverse court decisions that wipe out savings that were anticipated, that were voted on by the legislature, in fact. Do you or Mr. Taylor believe that it would be possible to have attorneys pay a little bit more heed to the crafting of the budget language that helps litigation proof to the highest degree possible? Whatever those provisions would be. I am of a mind that with careful legal verbiage that you are better legally defended, and that there are also some auxiliary actions that can be taken that builds in litigation proofing, and then further, when there are adverse decisions, that those be appealed, some a very long ways, even to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I certainly have advocated that in terms of prison litigation. Any thoughts about this? Is about realized savings, then, the question related to court decisions.
Not sure if I've actually developed an opinion on that. Clearly, throughout the process, there typically is a legal review of many of the bills that are drafted. Sometimes there's more time than others to actually review those. I agree with you on the prison comment that I can assure you that if there is a need to appeal, the administration is typically appealing those cases. Obviously, if a legal review or a more timely legal review can avoid these erosions, then I agree with your comment. I don't really know if I have a solution to the answer, though, to the question.
I would just suggest that as we deal with the language this year, that we at least pay some heed and cognizance to that. another question maybe of Mr. Taylor, and by the way, I want to confess an association with Mr. Taylor, just acknowledging to the public, we both hail from the same high school. I would assume that he's far better in math than I, based on his course of life and mine, and I surely think he is, but we both come from Sanger High School, and I guess we both would brag about that a bit. The in-process savings. We've gone maybe 6 months into this year with certain savings that we were anticipated that would be realized, some of which were stopped by court cases, but others that are in process. Could we not, maybe convene a hearing on this matter, bring appropriate parties before us, and examine where are we at? We've got now 6 months more, or whatever time we've got in the fiscal year. Could we not get about with more dispatch? Achieving the savings that are in process.
I think that would be a good oversight hearing. Mm-hmm. And I think you'd find that in some cases you had departments that didn't act as quickly as they should, and that would help hold them accountable. And in other cases, it was just that we made assumptions that weren't particularly reasonable, but even knowing that, I think, would be a good thing to find out.
Well, I think I would like to ponder that and consider it with the chair and with the speaker and the Republican leader as something that we would advocate for this House at least to look at. I really do believe that one of the big holes is the purported savings that may not be realized in the submission of a governor's budget, which is always really is a strategic document. It's a place where you begin your negotiations, and I say that to the world, being around a long time. So I don't get too alarmed about things I like or dislike in the governor's budget. It's just where we start. It's where we end up that counts. But then year after year we project and hope that these things are going to occur, these savings. They do not, or these revenues that may be forthcoming and they are not. We need to pay a little bit more heed and be more fastidious in our negotiations, I would suggest, in this regard. So I thank you for your responses.
Thank you. Members, the list of questioners that I have are Ruskin, Monning, Adams, Swanson, Arambula, and Bell. And if you have questions and you're not on the list, please raise your hand. And we'll go with Mr. Ruskin, then Mr. Monning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I'd like to address, with your permission, the resources section of the budget as chair of Subcommittee 3. To begin with, I want to address 3 key issues that concern me about the resources budget, and then direct questions to Mr. Giroux about those sections. The first issue, the governor is asking us to give unprecedented authority to block 25 projects per year from any CEQA lawsuits. We don't know what these projects will be. We don't know where they'll be, or what type of impact they may have on our environment. While legal challenges to CEQA can be abused, simply taking away the right to such legal recourse removes a key form of redress, a key check and balance from the environmental and legal process, and is very troubling to me. The second issue, the governor's offshore oil drilling proposal places one of our state's most valuable natural resources at great risk. Our coastline is part of our heritage and a vital economic asset which I believe we should not place at risk at any time, much less in a recession. Also, doing such drilling at a time when we must commit ourselves to developing alternative energy sources takes us, I believe, in the wrong direction. And lastly, the third issue, the governor's proposal relies on bond sales in several instances regarding the resources section. However, the state has been unable and may continue to be unable to sell enough bonds. Therefore, land conservation programs that depend on bond funds simply may not have enough cash to move programs forward, and that is troubling. So let me now address questions on each of these matters in the same order in which I mentioned them. First, regarding the governor asking us to give unprecedented authority to block 25 projects per year from any CEQA lawsuits, can you tell us what kind of projects you imagine will be chosen by the Business Transportation Agency to be expedited in this way? How would this proposal apply, for example, to potential controversial projects such as storage or alternative conveyance in the Delta?
I think the language for that is, still being developed, but the idea would be to have a set of criteria for picking those projects. Obviously, the intent there is to accelerate projects to create jobs. That's part of the jobs package. So clearly, part of the selection criteria would be those projects that are the furthest along in the environmental review process, that are getting close to being ready to go to construction, and that would produce the most economic value and job creation.
I think, I think it'll be very critical to see what the guidelines are, and also I think it has always been, I think, wise to presuppose that environmental protection and job creation are not necessarily at loggerheads. So it is risky at times to create policies based upon the opposite supposition, but we look forward to seeing your guidelines. The second question, if Tranquilon Ridge oil drilling is not approved by either the State Lands Commission or the legislature, how are you proposing to maintain the current funding for parks?
Mr. Ruskin, this is Karen Finn with the Department of Finance. If that doesn't happen, and at this time, just to clarify, we're only not asking the legislature to act on that, but merely hoping that the State Lands Commission will reconsider it. But if for some reason that doesn't happen, the budget bill that is presented to you gives the Department or the Director of Finance authority to backfill the Department of Parks to ensure that there's no reduction to their budget. It'll be with general fund.
All right. And thirdly, the issue of the governor's proposal in dealing with land conservation depending on bond funds. What is your best prognosis as to the actual availability, the actual ability of to be able to issue those bonds to do that?
I wish the Treasurer's Office was here to answer that, but they're the expert in that, as they have the most interaction with the market. But in our discussions with them, they're still hopeful. It will obviously depend on how the legislature reacts to the governor's budget proposals in the next couple of weeks, couple months, what kind of dialogue there is out in the market. But the Treasurer is prepared to enter the market. As I said, they're formulating their strategy and their timing right now. And you're right, we can't guarantee that, but we are hopeful that we will be successful. The budget assumes that there's approximately $7 billion of GO bonds sold this spring. It is not only for the land conservation programs, but all the other programs in the state, transportation, housing, K-12 schools.
Mr. Taylor, might I ask your opinion on the likelihood that we'd be able to issue enough bonds to bring to fruition the proposed funding for many items? My particular focus, because of my chairmanship of Sub 3, is on the land conservation issues.
Sure, because I think you got a couple of issues, and unfortunately today we were downgraded by one of the other agencies. We have been able to issue bonds. We haven't always been able to issue the full amount that we desired. And that's just a function of when you go to market of whether people will buy the amounts that we want. In this case, the $7 billion that they want in the spring. So no, you're not going to be guaranteed. And it also raises a larger question. In the coming year for 10-11, since you have to appropriate money for projects before then you go out for the bonds, if you felt like you were limited in some way, it's really important that you prioritize those bond projects, because we're talking about schools and other resource areas and corrections and all sorts of things. You may be put in the position as a legislature of prioritizing which bonds you want to make sure, or which projects will go forward. And to the extent there's some resources, you should get those high priority ones at the top of the list, the schools. So you may need to take a much more strategic approach to the amounts that you appropriate in the 10-11 budget to ensure that what bonds we can sell will fund those high priority projects.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. Mr. Monning, followed by Mr. Adams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for Mr. Giroux and then for Mr. Taylor. And Mr. Giroux, I want to thank you and your staff for your preparation helping walk us through this. I'm wondering what your calculations show related to the adverse impacts if the trigger is not hit, and the elimination of CalWORKs, IHSS, and Healthy Families is required. The governor's theme for economic recovery was jobs, jobs, jobs. And I'm wondering what your calculations illustrate, not just the savings of elimination of the program, but how many jobs will be lost by a family member who will have to leave a paying job to take care of a disabled family member who's lost their IHSS support, or what will the cost be to the state of somebody taken off IHSS who requires institutionalization still to be paid for by the state. What do your calculations illustrate? Job loss and added cost.
I don't think we have an actual analysis as far as job loss or other impacts. We do try to recognize cost and other programs that result from those other cuts. For more specifics, Mr. Buchan can help you.
Thank you.
Nick Buchan, Department of Finance. As Mr. Giroux indicated, the budget does recognize a cost shift to the Department of Developmental Services. And what sets that particular program apart from some of the others that I'll get into are that's a known entitlement. We have a tangible way of estimating how many IHSS recipients would go on to that program. So associated with the proposed reductions, not trigger, but the proposed reduction to IHSS in the core budget, it is assumed approximately $50 million general fund cost would shift to developmental services. In regard to other programs such as nursing homes, there are a variety of issues with trying to estimate that cost. One of the core issues is the capacity in the nursing homes. There simply aren't enough beds. So even if you were to assume that a significant portion of the IHSS population would go into institutional care, there isn't capacity for that. Another component is timing. There's no question that there could be savings realized, and that could take effect in a more immediate fashion than ultimately if some of these folks were to go into institutional care. The costs may occur at a later time. So you may have an issue of the costs are shifted to a future fiscal year. And the third issue is just simply there's not a clear relationship on a individual by individual basis of what that particular individual would do. A lot of the IHSS providers are relative providers, for example.
In terms of that piece, in terms of job loss, either related to IHSS, have you factored in family members having to leave a paid job to provide the family support in the home for a disabled family member?
The budget does not make an assumption relative to that.
The governor has indicated an allocation of $500 million towards jobs creation. Is any of that allocated towards hiring people who lose their jobs because of elimination of CalWORKs, IHSS, or Healthy Families?
Well, the initial monies from that program would be from the employment training program, which to fund training. And then the actual additional funds is if that person that received the training was hired, remained on the job for a certain period of time. So it's not really specific to a particular individual. It's more related to whoever receives the additional training.
I understand, and I understand that training money would be taken from an EDD account. Is that correct?
Yeah, the way it would work is it's the employment training funds, which are paid by employers now. That fund would borrow additional monies from the disability insurance fund, and then over time, the employment training fund would pay back that loan from the disability insurance fund.
Do you anticipate legal challenges to that?
Nona Martinez, Department of Finance. No, we don't anticipate legal challenge.
I think what would be helpful in the projection of the impacts of if we don't hit the trigger, well, both the proposed cuts and then the program eliminations if we don't hit the trigger, is to factor into the governor's commitment to job creation. How much deeper in a hole do we go from job loss as a result of those program eliminations? but I thank you for the responses you've provided. And for Mr. Taylor, in your, I think, earlier response to the governor's budget proposal, you did identify in terms of budget. Actually, it wasn't in response to the governor's presentation in his budget. It was your assessment of where your budget analysis going into 2010, 2011. And you suggested one category of exploring revenue options as part of an overall budget solution. And a few minutes ago, you alluded to some of the governor's revenue options like Trunkian Ridge. Are there any other categories not cited in the governor's budget that you think we would be well advised to look at in terms of revenue options? And forgetting for a moment political resistance to revenue options, just looking at business activity in the state, sources of revenue and economic activity, are there any other areas you would recommend we look at as part of a full budget solution, including cuts, borrowing, and revenue solutions?
Well, I think it's the tax expenditures that come to mind first, the special provisions where it's been shown that they're not very effective. And I think kind of the poster child for me are the enterprise zones, which you had a recent report from PPIC. And you've had lots of other studies that really question despite the well-intentioned thrust of those enterprise zones of generating greater activity in blighted areas. They just have not been shown to work very well, and that's hundreds of millions of dollars that we grant each year. So there's a handful of certain tax expenditures that I think would be well worth your looking at, and the advantage of them also is that they don't raise your overall tax rates, which is something I think you need to be cognizant of.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's helpful. Any other revenue options other than, have you illustrated those enterprise zones and other tax expenditures?
Yes, we have, and in our past documents we've had a list of various of those kind of provisions.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. Members, here's my updated list for questions. Adams, Swanson, Silva, Arambula, Harkey, and Bell. So if you're not on the list and you want to be, please raise your hand. Mr. Adams, followed by Mr. Swanson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I only have about 12 questions, and I'll add. I'm just kidding. No, I don't want the doc to kill me. I have just one for each of you. Mr. Drew, if I may start with you. It is a little troubling to hear that the department has identified potential cuts that could be made, and assuming that the trigger takes place and we don't receive the federal dollars, without a concurrent analysis to determine what the actual presumptive savings are going to be. I think Mr. Manning's point is well taken, that if you're going to eliminate a program and that program is going to have the net effect of putting more people on assistance at a higher level, then it's not really a cost savings. And it seems like that analysis should accompany the proposal, even if it's just a broad analysis and not a detailed one. At least gives us a sense of whether this is even a viable alternative to consider as part of, as Ms. Evans said, sort of the rehash and the recreation of a budget document. So it's a little troubling to see that. I did want to ask specifically, though, about the question of jobs as well, but as they relate to the revenue solutions. The revenue solutions seem to be predicated on the suspension or the elimination, but mostly the suspension of tax credits that arguably would feed into an increased production of jobs and revenue for the state of California vis-a-vis the ability to spend more at the employer level. Can you address how you think that's going to benefit an economy that is dependent upon jobs to pay that revenue?
Actually, I'll let Mark Hill answer that question.
Yeah, Mark Hill from Department of Finance. Generally, I think we would say that a one-year change in tax law probably doesn't have a big effect, a big immediate effect on jobs. What tends to be more the thing that incentivizes people to do things is what they view as permanent tax policy. Clearly, that will deprive those businesses that would have benefited, say, from the net operating loss deduction. They would have had that money in their, corporate exchequer and would have been able to spend it on expanding their business if there was a market for that. So it's hard to know. We don't try to get into the spin-off effects of individual tax policy changes in our overall economic and revenue estimates. That's a level of fine-tuning that's that's pretty much beyond our capabilities at this point. So, yes, in theory, it would have an effect. It certainly wouldn't be good. And so that's one of the reasons why you don't see tax increases in the main budget proposal.
Well, that does raise an interesting point, and your point is well taken. Businesses do rely upon what they perceive to be permanent tax changes to determine their business models or the manner in which they'll comport themselves. If we keep pulling the rug out from under them, if we say, oh, you're going to get the net operating loss, ability here, but now you're not, doesn't that, in theory, doesn't that provide for an unstable or uncertain future, and one that a business would likely just say, forget it, I can't trust in it?
It's certainly not desirable. That one is one that has, unfortunately, in some ways, been done before. So the expectation that net operating loss deduction will always be there. There's a track record of using that as a budget balancer in times past.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Taylor, just thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your office's diligence. And I am very anxious to see what other revenue alternatives you provide the legislature by way of consideration.
Thank you. Mr. Swanson, followed by Mr. Silva.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I witnessed the governor's interview where he called these budget cut proposals draconian, and I probably could agree with that. But I think they're also mean-spirited and unrealistic. Just to let you know where I'm coming from.
Could you clarify a little bit?
Mr. Giroux and staff, I would ask you, in your professional opinion, is there any way to solve California's systemic long-term budget crisis without new revenue?
We think the answer is yes. Where we are with economic recovery, the governor does not believe that this is the time to be looking at additional revenues. We understand that.
How do we solve the long-term systemic budget problem in California without additional revenue?
Well, it's our position that we need to continue to reduce our expenditures in line with our long-term revenue projections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I might add, this is Mark Hill again, that, one of the reasons for the federal funds proposals is, frankly, that is contributing to our structural budget deficit, the low level of federal funds that we get for many programs. To the extent that we can get a permanent change in those funding ratios, that will go a long way to erasing our long-term structural problems.
So are you modifying his answer by saying additional federal income revenue would assist in addressing that issue?
For example, our proposal to increase our FMAP rate from 50 to 57%, that we intend to seek and hopefully get that money, and that would be a long-term solution. Mm-hmm. That is not viewed to be a one-time solution to our Medi-Cal costs.
Yeah, Mr. Taylor, I would ask you this question, the same question. Is there any way to solve California's long-term systemic budget problem without new revenues?
Well, in the past, I would say yes, because we have typically, the economy has bounced back to the point where it reached the level where it would have been had you not had the recession. And I think that's in part why I was willing to recommend to you enact some temporary tax increases to buy you time for that economy to recover. Mm-hmm. This recession seems to be very different. We're not rebounding. I don't think anyone, certainly not finance or our office, is forecasting that we're going to get back to a level that we would have been absent the recession at any time in the near future. That makes answering your question much more difficult, because you may need to do some revenue things that last not just for a year or two, but maybe that last for 3 or 4 or 5. Mm. At some point, maybe those don't have to be permanent, though. Mm-hmm. And I would caution you, the point that Mr. Hill made, that shorter-term tax increases are much less distorting. Mm-hmm. They don't have the same negative effect. So I'm not going to sit here and say you shouldn't consider some revenue increases that help get you back, buy you time, help get you back to the level that hopefully you'll be at in 4 or 5 years from now if the economy eventually rebounds. But this is a very different situation than we've experienced in the past.
I appreciate that professional answer. I think that we are very disingenuous with the public if we act here as if more revenue is not going to be required to address these issues. If anyone on the panel thinks that if you eliminate in-home service care workers and the counties will not have to pick up that cost, and the taxpayers in those counties are not going to have to some kind of way shoulder the burden, then we're being very, very unrealistic. And it goes down the line of each of these proposals that are made. Someone will pay the cost of these services. Now, because we don't show the courage, or the organization or the professional fortitude to go forward with solutions that will solve this problem does not mean that someone else is not going to have to step up to the plate and pay for these services. I would ask you gentlemen, have you, in looking at your budget proposal, did you identify a lot of waste in the state budget? Point out where the state waste is.
Well, I think one piece of our employee compensation proposal is that we're recognizing that we think that departments can reduce their payroll costs by 5%, and so we're basically going to be asking them to continue doing what they're doing with a 5% cut to their payroll.
How do you score that? What does that give us?
It's that one particular piece is approximately $450 million.
Uh-huh. And how do you score the cuts to these programs in terms of additional federal revenue that we will not receive as a state by the elimination, the wholesale elimination of these programs that are listed in the trigger? Have you scored that?
Are you asking what level of federal funds we won't receive? Is that the question?
Yes.
I'm not sure if we have the exact number. We could try to tally it and get back to you.
We're talking billions?
Yeah, it would be in the billions, yes.
So now we're confronted with considering these budget proposals without, as my distinguished colleague Mr. Adams pointed out, without a clear calculation of the consequences of these decisions in terms of additional federal dollars. So we're not seeing the whole picture in terms of the impact on the state. And so wouldn't that make a difference in terms of how we would consider adjusting our budget if we were reducing expenditures in one area versus another area if we knew that there's substantial federal dollars tied to that other area, in addition to additional consequences that Assemblymember Morning pointed out, those additional adverse impacts around employment. And so I don't know how you got to your decision without at least calculating those additional federal dollar impacts, which are in the billions, to the state. How do we make a decision without knowing those numbers?
Nick Buchan again with Finance. To be clear, the non-trigger issues, the issues that are in the budget, the budget does assume the corresponding loss in federal funds, county funds, whatever the other fund source was. It wasn't just a general fund exercise. The trigger was specific to asking the question if the federal funds that we're asking for, we're seeking, were not to materialize, what corresponding amount of general fund savings would we need to achieve?
Yeah. Let me ask you this question. On the LAO's analysis, page 14, when it talks about revenue solutions, if the trigger, in effect, you have $2.3 billion in revenue solutions. Is that right?
Yeah. On the trigger list, I believe there's $2.4 billion of revenues.
Okay, so it is. So you do admit, even within your own budget proposal, that there are scenarios when we have to generate new revenue.
Well, the federal funds are our proposal to solve the $19.9 billion problem.
I got that.
The trigger is a mechanism in the event that we don't receive those federal funds.
I got that.
And so, yes, the trigger does recognize that we may have to do some one-year delays of those.
Madam Chair, I'm going to conclude by just saying, we can go through this every year and attempt to kick the ball down the road. And I understand we have a term-limited environment, and some of us will be here for 3 more years, some for 5, and we will move on. But the people of California and our state really deserve a solution to this problem, a realistic, transparent solution. It's going to involve us all pulling together. This question of revenue is not one that we can avoid. We can either show a lack of courage, and we give it to the counties and the cities to raise parking fees and the like, and we can do it in a very clumsy way where we're not all pulling together. We could also stumble our way into a budget process where we don't identify priorities. I tend to think we should identify those priorities, and there ought to be education. There ought to be making sure that we take care of health care, and we make sure that we develop jobs for the people in our state, which help us all in generating revenue. And so I hope that this becomes a very serious budget discussion, because California is clearly at the crossroads. And I agree with the chair's opening comments. This is a very serious moment for us, and I hope that we're up to the task.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. I do want to note, for the benefit of everybody involved, that you actually raised a couple of issues that I would hope that the committee, the Budget Committee and the subcommittees would start to explore in the coming weeks. One is the amount of federal dollars that we would be turning away by either eliminating or cutting in a major way these programs. In addition to the federal dollars we have already turned away with the cuts that we've made during this current fiscal year, and thereby removed from our state's economy. And the other question of, if we were to adopt this proposal, how much of the state responsibility and services that we currently provide would then be shoved onto the local level, whether it's a city or a county or a school district. I think that's something, as you said, we need to have the whole picture in making this decision. Mr. Silva, followed by Mr. Arambula.
Chair. In 1990, there was an article written, and there's been several articles written on this subject, about the graduating high school class of 1990 having a lower standard of living than their parents. And when I first read that, I thought, what in the world is going on? How can this be? The United States is a country where it seems like our standard of living continues to go up every year. But when you look at the budget problems that we're facing right now, and you have unemployment that's up. I remember 1995, Orange County had an unemployment rate of 2.7. Now it's close to 9%. Revenue is down in the state. Well, the reason revenue is down is people don't have jobs, so they can't go to the store and make those cash registers work. Many people are losing their homes, and the value of houses are going down, so we have less property tax that the state is bringing in. And then you also have state income tax. If people aren't working, they're not paying into the state income tax. This is very simple to figure out. And to compound the problem, you have California taxpayers that are leaving the state. Businesses are leaving because they feel they can increase their profit margin by relocating in Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Alabama. You have individuals, and I think probably everybody in this room have friends that are retired out of California and have moved out of the state because they can live cheaper in another state. They don't have to pay California state income tax. The people that are receiving government subsidized programs is increasing as we lose taxpayers out of the state. So this is putting a bigger gap in our budget. And last May, it went before the voters. Would you like to vote for higher taxes? It was very clear. They said no. And I feel part of the reason that people are saying no is that they feel California has been taking on for a long time problems of other countries. I know I read in the paper a young child from Mexico had an eye operation in California, in Orange County. It was over $50,000. I think that's great that we can provide that, but there's a point in time where we can no longer take care of the world's problems. Korea, I know there are people from Korea that live in the United States that enjoy the benefits here, but they've never paid into it, but yet they receive the benefits. And I think that a lot of taxpayers are not happy with that. California taxpayers are mad when they see State University or University of California presidents making in excess of $450,000 a year in salaries. And then when they retire, they get a year's salary as a bonus. I think people in California are upset when they see the class sizes at the University of California at 400 students. And you have the classes that are being taught by TAs. That's not fair. That's not right. And you look at the teaching load of the professors, and it's 5 hours, 7 hours, and they say, well, we're doing research. Well, California taxpayers are paying for this, and they're not happy. The federal government refuses to seal the California borders. We have people coming into California. I'm not arguing that they don't have a reason to come into California, but what I am arguing is the fact that the state of California is paying for something that the federal government has bought into. And the list goes on and on. So I think that we have to deal with the cards that are in front of us. I would like to see a lot of these government programs in California continue. If we don't have the money, then we have to sit down and figure out how we're going to make it work. And it's just like when you're playing solitaire. There's one person that you can't cheat when you play solitaire, and that's yourself. And I think that we as a body are going to have to deal with what's in front of us and not what we'd like it to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Harkey, followed by Mr. Bell.
Thank you. I want to thank you both for your presentation. I think there's no doubt about it. This is extremely difficult. It was extremely difficult last year, and I quite honestly think it's going to be worse this year. So I think everyone needs to brace themselves. As for funding bonds, I think it's quite honestly a bit laughable to think we're going to be funding a lot of general obligation bonds for anything. We're going to be needing to fund bonds to fill the cash flow hole that we have. We are nearing non-investment grade status on our rating, and we really need to get our act together on a long-term solution as well as fill the holes in this one. The sooner we reduce our expenses here, the better off we'll be, or the sooner we balance our budget, because we are continuing to spend at a level that we know we cannot afford, and that's really unfortunate. As I understand, Mr. Ruskin asked about the CEQA. As I understand, it's not CEQA exemption. It's actually to limit some of the liability. As I understood this to be, it was once an approved EIR was in the works with the approving agency, the local jurisdictions or whatever. At that point, then those programs would be considered for a streamlining of, limiting liability or frivolous lawsuits. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's basically what the proposal is. It's designed to, once there is a final EIR or one that's very close to being one, and it still would have to be completed, that the BT&H agency could exempt that particular project from litigation. And I think that's one of the things that causes projects to be delayed a long time is lengthy litigation.
Right. So we're not exempting the CEQA process. We're just trying to circumvent some of the litigation that really is time-consuming more than successful in actually stopping the project. As for the offshore drilling, it's kind of interesting. One of the comments I did hear in Rev and Tax from the gentleman that came from Connecticut, and his name escapes me now, but he's quite an expert.
Mr. Pomp.
Yes, yes. He was very interesting, but one of the things he did say, an assumption, and it's pretty pretty clear to me. I'm not so sure he understands California as far as our environmental regulations, but he said we had a lot of natural resources and that we could use them. And even though we do have resources, we are severely restricted in the way that we may use them. And one of the things that I would like to see this body seriously consider is not necessarily offshore drilling, quote unquote, but anything that could augment some of our resources from an onshore position, because I understand that technology exists. And, I don't want to get into a big contest on the floor where we know there's no way, because I think in the Assembly right now, offshore drilling is probably off the table. But I do think that drilling onshore for an offshore product should be considered in this Assembly. Again, to go back to the bonds, I know that we're looking to fund bonds for a variety of purposes to keep certain things going, and I do think that if that's one area that we are going to have to definitely set priorities, because they will be set for us. Because as we continue to borrow, our borrowing on general obligation bonds has gone from about $60 billion to $73 billion this year. And as we continue to borrow and our credit rating is lower, the interest takes up more and more of our general fund. So I think that as we look at these potential reductions in our social service programs and those for those who can least afford them, we have to consider the other programs that we want to bond for, because the more debt we assume, the more interest we're going to have to pay. And if we pay more interest, that comes as a direct hit to the general fund. As a matter of fact, I believe that you, Mr. Taylor, had a report that showed in your projection year that by 2015 that pension obligations and debt service would comprise 15% of the general fund.
That sounds about right.
Right. And so I think we seriously as a House need to start looking at our bonding priorities, and if in fact some of these bonds that were voter approved in good times we can't maybe reduce in some fashion, because I don't think the voters would make the same decisions now that they made in the boom years. So I think we need to consider that. I would also like to see, if I could, a projection on a cash flow basis, the cash flow projection for the next year from the Department of Finance. And also, I'd like to see a cash flow projection based on flat revenues remaining flat, because I think that's more realistic as to what we could be facing here when we go to the market and try to get our RANDs in July. We need to really look at what we're going to be able to access. Stability and consistency in the tax code, you're right, is the most important thing. So whatever we do, I would hope that this body would not consider future increases. If we have to remain consistent in an area, maybe that's what we have to do. But I'm very concerned with the job market and the reactions and the capital investment side. I think that we can probably maybe reduce payroll by attrition, which is what's happening in a lot of companies as people leave, maybe not replace, if that might not be a potential here, and as well as maybe task our best and our brightest in our departments. We hire some very highly intelligent people from the state of California to maybe find some cost savings in their departments to make recommendations for same. I'd like to see that happen. The people that work for us and with us and for this great state need to be part of the process here, not have it always done to them. So I would like to see us ask each department to submit maybe some ideas for cost savings that they would like to see, which would help the state of California and the rest of us here on the legislature to make some decisions. It's much better to have somebody involved than just takes things from them. So I think we all know we're in this boat together. We've got some tough sledding, and we will have probably tough sledding for the next 2 to 5 years, I would say. And I don't think we can look at this and ignore that. So I'd like to work on this immediate budget, and I'd also like to work on some long-term reforms that establish some credibility with our banking institutions that we're going to be relying on for bonding, to let them know that we understand the gravity of the situation and that we're willing to make some long-term restructuring, take some long-term restructuring steps here in the state of California to show that we can repay our debt and that we understand and that we don't have to have things done to us, that we can discipline here in this House. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Harkey. On the issue of the debt service and impacting the general fund, this committee did hold a very lengthy, in-depth hearing in December with the LAO and the treasurer being in attendance to testify. And so we have started to take a look at that, and you're exactly right. It's become a Pac-Man of our general fund. Let's see, I still have a number of speakers, and we're trying to conclude our work by 4 o'clock, so I'm trying to be mindful of the clock. Mr. Bell, followed by Mr. Arambula if he's returned, and then Ms. Fuller. Mr. Bell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I look at the table on page 6 of the LAO report, one of the things I noticed right away was that a lot of the solutions are in budget year, not in the current fiscal year. And I think that we need more quicker resolution of some of the issues so that we can apply some of the savings in this fiscal year. If we apply some of the savings, more savings than shown here in this fiscal year, or get more revenue in this fiscal year, in other words, if we work hard and come to some agreement now, quickly, and try to get a quick agreement on some things, we can get more than $1.2 million worth of solutions, $1.2 billion. And I think that's one thing I noticed. I just want to comment that to my colleagues. And then what that would do, that would help us in terms of things like the cash flow, interest payments, all those kinds of issues. And I would like to see certain issues identified where there's a potential for savings if we had some quick resolutions. In other words, what can we work on that if we came together and all the stars were right and we got out of our sandbox and we all worked together like we're supposed to, what can we come up with right away that would solve some of these budget problems so we can have more than $1.2 billion. And I think I have some ideas, okay? I think the federal funds, I know is an idea that there may be some federal funds or some federal flexibility, if I call it, not necessarily federal funds, but federal flexibility that we can ask for. I think this IHSS issue, I think there's ways of maybe not looking at the people that are least disabled, but looking at the people that are the most disabled and try to identify them as more of health-related cost in terms of a program that has a better cost-sharing ratio. So we look at the people that are really disabled, and I think you have the right idea going to the Department of Developmental Services, but there are other people that aren't eligible for the Department of Developmental Services that are really disabled people that really have serious health problems, and that's why they're getting IHSS services. Some of those services should be provided by the Medicare system. Federal Medicare system is supposed to be the safety net for severely disabled people, and I think that's part of the answer. My understanding is the kinship guardianship assistance. Right now, you're assuming only the prospective children in the foster care system in that program are counted as being entered in that. And my understanding is we have a preliminary decision that we're going to have all our California kids counted, and whoop-you-do. We all supported that. Many of our Republican and our Democrat colleagues signed and got behind that. We are succeeding in that, and it looks like all the kids will be covered. So that's a victory for California. And I think that would generate a significant amount of money, as much as $60 million that's not shown in your budget at this point. And that was just this week. So, and I have to applaud Speaker Bass for, we've been working on this for a year and a half. It's been a tough fight, and we're finally getting to the fruition of our work. The other area I think that we really can get some quick fix, and we have a lot of county supervisors, ex-county supervisors, myself and many of the others, and other people that worked at county government in the State Assembly. There's a great deal of experience. And I think we need to have agreement with the counties. And I think with the counties saving money earlier would be with an agreement. Would help ameliorate some of the things you're doing with the counties. The counties want flexibility. They want guaranteed revenue. They don't want to have the rug pulled out from under them. We have to have more discussions with them. We may be able to save some money early by having them tell us what would help them. And opening the dialogue right now, I think, for a county agreement is important. And then lastly, I think we got to help the safety net. And I think we need to wake up about food stamps. And we have the lowest rate of food stamp participation in the United States. There's over 2 million people that can be eligible. There hasn't been an effort yet on the part of the administration to open the doors to allow more people and simplify the food stamp process. We need to get behind that. We need to have the doors open. The food stamp program, we're only talking about $4, $3 to $4 a day per person. We're only talking about $247 a month for a family of 3. We don't need to have some extreme regulatory environment to get the food to people. There's food here in California. There's people that are growing food. We can connect the food growers with the food programs better and stimulate the economy in that way and get billions of dollars, literally, of food stamp allocations to California. And then we also need to have, if you want to talk about economic development, there ought to be like a total earned income tax credit program to get people that are qualified. And I think there's been much study done on this. There's billions of dollars of unused earned income tax credits that should be for Californians that are in the safety net category. We can get those people their earned income tax credit. That can be thousands of dollars for those families that are eligible, that would use that money to stimulate our economy, that go out and buy things, and perhaps prevent them from being homeless. We need quick agreements on these things. We don't need the negotiation mentality kind of thing. Let's get together and settle these things quickly, and we can come up with more than $1.2 billion in this fiscal year, and that would help us the next fiscal year and make the hits a lot softer next fiscal year. And I'd like to have your response to any of those.
Well, I'll just respond at a high level first. The reason that the governor did call the special session is that take away the Prop 98 reduction. Yeah. The two largest areas of government are Health and Human Services and Corrections. And the reason we ask for the early action, especially in those areas, is because it does take a great deal of time to implement those actual reductions, especially in corrections, which is a staffing issue. There's always a lag time. But so that's why we are open to, we asked for March 1 action. We are open to looking at doing some of these things as quickly as possible, but not necessarily to always get more savings in the current year, but at least to maximize the savings in the budget year. So.
Yeah, but I'm saying if you can be creative and get some savings this fiscal year.
Yeah, we don't disagree.
Yeah,
It's just
can
kind of difficult in some of those areas of government.
Thank you.
Max, do you have any comments about that?
No, and I think you raise a larger point of, regardless of what we do on the budget cuts, if you increase food stamp participation, which the only state cost is the small administrative charge, or you increase the EITC, that you've helped kind of mitigate maybe some other actions that you feel like you have to do. So it's a little bit kind of just gravy is kind of what you're saying. So obviously, to the extent that we can find ways to increase food stamp participation, it's on the federal government, and it's just a positive for the state.
It's 100% federal. The food stamps
For the program cost.
And then we split the cost with the counties
And the feds.
and the federal government for the administration. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fuller.
Thank you for your really difficult work on a really, really difficult issue. As I look at Figure 4, I think it really sort of summarized everything for me on 19. Basically, we're out of money. In fact, we owe a lot of money. Something I care about greatly, education, is experiencing growth in its funding, but the growth in its funding is barely mitigating the loss in the property taxes, which is a very small part of the overall funding. But in this case, as you look down, you can see K-12 is going to have a 3.8% growth. California Community Colleges is 7% growth. Other agencies, a little different, but the total general fund grows at 4.1%, but the local property tax revenue decreases by 8.7%. So somehow we have got to get to the place where we can make the asset holders of California more able to produce what we need, because this is still a downward spiral. We are still increasing the debt load and continuing to lose revenue. So, anyway, I'm going to have to think about that a little bit. But the second step is, okay, so what is the likelihood? How hard is it going to be for us to pass this budget? And when I look at this budget, it's so finely balanced on the proposition that if we do this to Prop 98, then we gain this, then we get this, and any one thing taken out of there, any one line that can't reach agreement, throws the whole budget back out. It won't work. In other words, you just can't pull out any one brick without the whole thing tumbling. So guys, I'm really worried about us because that is a very difficult proposition for us to, in a legislature designed like ours, to actually handle. I mean, our process is about give and take, about at the end of the day, coming up with some amended pieces, and this budget doesn't look like it's going to be able to do that. So I hope we have all of us in this room, because it's not one person's responsibility. I hope that all of us basically have the chance to try to figure out, so how can we come up with a process that allows us to deal with an all or nothing issue, number one, and number two, how can we come up with a strategy that begins increasing our asset holders' ability to hold, make, and retain money that they can pass on to us. So that's just my comments for today. I'm overwhelmed, and I'm surprised you guys are still coming to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller. I had Mr. Arambula on my list for questions, but since he doesn't appear to be here, he was our last person. So that wraps up the question portion of our hearing. Mr. Taylor, Mr. Giroux, did you have any final last brief statements you'd like to make? Thank you very much, both of you, for coming and testifying, and to your staffs as well. Members, I think we heard from a lot of the questions and a lot of the comments, because there were a lot of comments here about different things that we need to be looking at. And in part, the hearing that was devoted to beginning oversight and discussion and debate on the governor's proposal has gone into the broader picture, which is the state of our economy and the long-term fiscal outlook for the state of California. And I think that's very appropriate for us to be grappling with right now. But I think it's very clear we have a lot of issues to discuss and a lot of debate going forward and a lot of work to do. And I thank everybody for your participation. It's been a long hearing, but most everybody stuck here with it to hear what everybody had to say. And I think this is a very beginning to a very difficult process that we are going to be undergoing. And thank you so much for being here, and we're adjourned.
Thank you, Noreen.